Hello everyone, welcome to Wednesday, welcome to the Northeast Georgia History Center, and welcome to the American Revolution. We're going to share with you today just a brief overview of what happened during the American Revolution, how we got to the point of rebelling against Great Britain. We're going to tell you a little bit about the life of a soldier and a woman's perspective on the American Revolution. But first, let me go ahead and go into the causes. Now, of course, like with any armed conflict, these causes can be incredibly complex, but really it comes down to one war going into another war. We had fought the French and Indian War against France, and that had opened up an entire new empire for British North America. It expelled most of the European powers from a large part of the continent, and Britain was set to expand that empire. But that war was very expensive. They had to pay for it somehow, and they had to control how that empire was going to be divided out amongst the citizens of Great Britain. This really are the two main causes that led to the conflict. Great Britain had to raise taxes on the colonists to pay the debt that they had fought the war for, and they were trying to control American immigration into these new countries and into these new lands, and the Native Americans, of course, didn't want their lands taken over by these new expansionist Americans. So with the difference of how these lands were going to be accessed, how this old war was going to be paid for through greater taxation, and who was going to decide who got taxed and how much, these conflicts eventually came up as a difference of opinion, a severe difference of opinion between the American colonists and the powers in Great Britain. They tried to negotiate through this. They tried to remain peaceful, and they even had different gatherings of the different colonies. Two of those took place in Philadelphia, the First and the Second Continental Congress, where they would write letters to the king's ministers and eventually to the king himself, asking for them to understand the American perspective. And the colonists tried to make this not the king's fault, because if they went against the king, that was treason. They tried to be good British citizens up until the point where they no longer felt that was going to get their grievances addressed and resolved. So on July 2nd, 1776, they did eventually declare independence. Now notice I said July 2nd. That is when they voted to become independent. It was declared on July 4th. So there is a little bit of a difference there. That's some great trivia for you. But when independence was declared, American soldiers had already been fighting for almost a year against the forces of the British Crown. And at first this was just militia, just regular everyday people coming out in their regular clothes with whatever weapons they had at home to fight against the British. But the leaders of the American cause knew if they were going to defeat the British, they were going to have their own professional, equipped, well-trained army. And this is something George Washington very strongly believed in. And he created the Continental Army. And it's called the Continental Army because it was an army of everyone from every colony. It wasn't the state army of Georgia or Virginia or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts. It represented the entire continent. And so the Continental Army. And eventually, the Americans knew that the only hope they really had to win against Great Britain was to ally themselves with another powerful country like France, because the Americans did not have their own navy. That navy was going to become very important, and they didn't have their own source of manufacture and supply for weapons and uniforms. So after winning a very important battle at Saratoga, the French did agree to support the Americans, and they began sending not only uniforms, not only weapons, but actual French troops and French ships to fight for the American cause. And by that point, the Continental Army had gotten good enough so that it could stand up to the British Army in the north. And so the British shifted their attention to the south. They knew they couldn't win in the north, around New Jersey, Delaware, New York, Pennsylvania. They decided to go south, and the first colony that they took back for the crown was the colony of Georgia. Now, that was the only one they really got, but they continued to move into South Carolina and North Carolina, and they did pretty well until some very brave soldiers ended up fighting against the British and defeating them when the British tried to get away from the coast and go into the backcountry. Folks like Daniel Morgan, Nathaniel Greene led Continental soldiers and militia against the British, and the British just couldn't get a good foothold in the South either, so they decided that they would try to unite their armies. So General Cornwallis in the South marches north to try to link up with the forces of the British, especially those in New York, and he gets trapped at Yorktown. And at Yorktown, George Washington brings his army down, there's a French army that has landed, and the French Navy is able to push the British Navy out to sea, and the entire force under Cornwallis surrenders. This is not the end of the war. This is in 1781, and the war is going to go on officially for a couple of more years, but that's really the big last event, because the people of Great Britain no longer wanted to fight this war. They were also worried about taxes, how expensive this war was becoming. They were worried about how many of their fathers and sons and brothers were going to fight in this war in America to no purpose. So eventually in 1783, at the Treaty of Paris, negotiated by Benjamin Franklin among others, the British agreed to recognize American independence, and the American army after that dispersed, and a new nation took its place among the nations of the earth, as the Declaration of Independence says. So that is the brief cause of the war. That's the brief course of the war. There's a lot more to it. I'm sure many of y'all have studied it, and if you haven't yet, you have a great, amazing, remarkable, inspiring narrative ahead of you. Now I want to talk a little bit about the men who might have fought with the Continental soldiers. They're, of course, going to need to carry everything that they're going to need. They're infantry, right? They may have some wagons for some tents and things, but they have to carry all their stuff. And you notice when I walked on screen, I had 2 items, and these 2 items are probably the most important part of what makes a soldier and makes him an effective fighter. Now, most of you probably know what this is. It's my musket that I actually fight with. I'll come back to that in a second. What about this? This looks like a great big tin can, and in effect, that's what it is. This is a tin kettle. And this tin kettle would be issued to about every 8 to 10 men. And all those men would put all their food together and cook it together in this one tin kettle. This is what they would cook in and day out. So each soldier would take a turn to carry this on the march. This is not one of those big cast iron pots. It's just thin tin. It is kind of like a tin can, so it's not too heavy. It's not too hard to carry, but they did take turns. They may put some of their rations in there. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to the side, and I can come back to the musket now. So this musket, this is actually a French model musket because it represents those that were given to the American forces by the French. It's like all flintlock muskets of the time. It's a muzzleloader that you have to fire one round lead ball. I think I have an example here in my pocket. You can come a little closer. You can see this lead ball, right? That's what it would fire. You have to put it in this way. And there's an entire process to fire this weapon. It's a flintlock, which means you see this has this piece of steel here and a piece of flint held together in this. This is a cock because it looks like a pecking chicken, right? What happens when flint strikes steel? Well, let's take a look. Did you see those sparks? Those sparks are what makes the weapon fire. So to fire the weapon, I'm going to take one of my paper cartridges out of my cartridge box. I'm going to rip it off. I'm going to put a little bit here in the pan, close that pan. I'm going to put the powder down the barrel. Then I'm going to put the lead ball down the barrel. Take out my ramrod, ram it down, and I have to put the ramrod back, right? Because that's how the weapon works. And then I'll bring it up like this, and then I'll be told to make ready, take aim, and fire. Boom. I'm not going to fire right now because that would be too loud and smoky. But you have hundreds and hundreds of men learning to march together, learning to fire their weapon together, and this is called drill, all right? And one of the helpers of the American Army that lots of people know about, von Steuben, taught them how to do this, and they all got pretty good at it, right? But there's other parts to it. You don't just fire a weapon. This is the 18th century. And in the 18th century, they realized that you're not going to be able to fire a lot from this, so they want to make this an even more effective weapon. So they can use this. This, of course, is called a bayonet. And what this bayonet does is it turns this not only into a big, strong, pokey weapon, but I have a good amount of range, right? Woo. That can come right at you. That can be pretty intimidating with that blade on the end of the musket. And that allows me to march forward with my friends and take out the enemy. Now, sometimes you would get close enough to use the bayonet, but not usually. Usually one side or the other would decide to break away and run. So this bayonet can also be used for very handy things like digging in the ground or maybe holding candles in camp or something like that. So the musket is an important part of what makes me a soldier, but there's other things that I'm going to need to be a soldier besides the musket. Let me set this down and I'll show some of those to you. So as I turn around backwards, I'll go to the side. You can see I have my cartridge box. When I turn around back, you can see I have this bag. This is a haversack. This is where my food goes. And I have this, the knapsack. And in that knapsack, I'm going to have just an extra blanket and maybe some very basic things like soap or a razor to shave with, a mirror, some things like that. And of course, I have my bayonet over here. Now, so I can take my knapsack off. I want you to take a look at it. It's kind of small, right? I've seen women's purses much bigger than this thing. But a Continental soldier is not going to have that much to carry. As I said, they're going to have just a blanket, right? Just a blanket in there, and maybe one sack of things that's going to be some personal items. Like I said, maybe a toothbrush, some soap, a razor so they can keep their face clean shaven. This is how soldiers showed themselves. It was very, very common to shave in the 18th century. And then in my haversack, this is where my personal rations are going to go that I share out with my fellow people when we cook them in the tin. I've got a cup. I have just a real basic wooden bowl, right? Nothing fancy there, just a bowl and a cup. And I have a spoon and a fork, right? Just like we have at home, except this fork only has 2 tines on it, not the 3 or 4 that we're used to. Something else that's going to be issued to soldiers at this time very frequently is called ship's biscuit. Now this is the hardtack of later days from the Civil War, but notice it's round instead of square. It's still nice and hard, right? It's nice and hard. It'll keep that way as you march along. It's able to maintain fairly decent nutrition, even when it's hot, when it's wet, things like that. Now, just to show you a little bit of the uniform. So this is, again, you probably recognize this kind of Continental uniform. It has red lapels and red cuffs, right? It's got sort of tails to it that can be unbuttoned here and fold forward in case it's cold weather. That'll keep me more warm. I have some knee breeches that only come up to my knee. I have woolen hose and those classic buckle shoes from the 18th century. But something you may see that maybe is different than what you thought it would be. When most people think of a Continental soldier under General Washington, they think of those blue coats with red, and you notice that this is actually brown. Early in the war, a lot of those uniforms from France would come in different colors, not just blue, but brown especially, and sometimes green. And so they had to take lotteries. They would draw names out of a hat to see which regiments got which coat. So I happen to have a brown coat that would have gone with some of those regiments, especially those regiments that were with George Washington when he crossed the Delaware at the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. So this brown coat is still a Continental coat. It just may be a little bit different than you're used to. Now, this is how a soldier looks. This is how a soldier marches. This is a soldier's equipment. And soldiers were pretty much all men in this time. This was a man's job. And something that women were not allowed or encouraged. But women certainly played a role in the American Revolution. Talk a little bit about that. I'm going to invite our patriot, Marie Walker, to tell you a little bit about what.
Hello, good day to you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what women did during the American Revolution using some examples that you might have heard of before. So first off, we're going to talk about Abigail Adams, and she was the wife of John Adams. And during the American Revolution, when her husband was away, either with the Continental Congress or fighting in the American Revolution or doing his political things away from home, she was in charge of raising the children as well as running their estate. So she would make decisions about the crops to be planted and things that went on.
Let's pause for a second.
Oh, we're going to
Sorry,
pause.
we got some sound problems going on. So let's see.
We are holding.
Oh, fixed? Okay, so Marie, go ahead and speak and let's see. Let's just do a quick test.
All right, testing? Testing? Can everyone hear me? Good, yes.
I'm going to wait till they can answer.
Gives us thumbs up.
Yeah, all right. Looks like thumbs up. Think we are good. I'm going to check on our end really quick. Okay, I believe we're good.
All right. We'll pick up where we left off. We were talking about Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, who was very much in charge of their estate while her husband was away doing things with the Continental Congress and overseeing the American Revolution. So she was very much in charge of the children. She was in charge of their estate and everything that entailed. Women at this time were not allowed to own property themselves. It would become, if they had property, it would become property of their husbands when they married. But she, at this time, was really referring to their property as hers. She kind of reclaimed it, not necessarily in a legal sense. That was not possible, but very much in the ideological sense, she very much thought of herself as in charge of that realm. There are many letters between Abigail and John where they are talking about things that are going on at the house, what they're doing. One of the big things that they kind of had this debate about going back and forth was whether to inoculate their children, which is kind of like the early idea of vaccines against smallpox during the American Revolution. This was a disease that wiped out a large population. It was very much, when it happened or struck a community, it was very devastating. But then they came up with this idea of inoculation, which would be when you run a thread through the pox of someone who was infected, and then they would run the needle and thread through the skin of a healthy person. That gives them a slight, the disease in a smaller amount, very much like what you do with today's vaccines, and therefore you might get a little sick, but you're not going to die from it. So that's an example of what Abigail Adams was doing during the American Revolution. And then we are going to go to Eliza Schuyler, or as she is later known, Eliza Hamilton, because she became the wife of Alexander Hamilton, the Revolutionary War hero. And she was doing things such as gathering clothing, gathering food, and either giving it to people who were in need because their supporter, their husband or brothers, and someone who was to provide for them was either away fighting the American Revolution, or she was giving these things to soldiers themselves because the supply train was not always able to keep up with the American army themselves. We also have a woman right here from Georgia, Nancy Hart, and she is almost larger than life, more myth and legend than historical fact, but we have some things that have happened later that I'm going to get into in just a second that do corroborate her story. So Nancy Hart, we have several towns and a whole county named for her here in Georgia, was actually named Ann Hart, but Nancy was a nickname for Anne at the time. So Nancy Hart was living out in a cabin up in northeastern Georgia, and that's also an area where some British soldiers were hanging out as well as continental soldiers. And there are lots of stories of incidences of British soldiers coming to spy on Nancy Hart and see what she was up to, and she would fend them off and shoo them away. But the biggest story of hers is when there were, I believe it was 6 redcoats came into her house and they killed her last chicken and they demanded that she cook it for them. And she was not about to have that, but she was a smart woman. So she had them come into her house, she got them drunk on her corn liquor, and then while they were not exactly the most focused of people, she snuck out their guns through the side of her log cabin. So we know it was a very rustic log cabin, which means there were gaps between the logs, and that's how she passed them out of her house to one of her many children. And then she kept one and held them at gunpoint, waiting for either her children to go signal someone or just until Continental troops came by to then capture them. During the time when she was holding at gunpoint, one soldier actually rushed her and she shot him dead. And then the rest of them decided that they were not going to try that. Eventually, her husband and some other Continental soldiers came by. They held trial because they had killed her chicken, and then they hung them the next day. And that is the tale of Nancy Hart. It's hard to say whether for sure that happened or not, but it is some archaeological evidence happened where they went to where they believed the Hart cabin was, and they did find the body of 6 men. So the story is plausible, but we aren't exactly for sure. But that is Nancy Hart. She was said to be a 6-foot, red-headed, burly woman, which I think that's just a larger-than-life character. She was also illiterate, so it's not like she could necessarily write or recount the story in some type of writing that would become a historical document. This is a challenge for historians, as if you have a large portion of the population that is illiterate, it is hard for them to then create documents that survive them. So you go on oral history. And that brings me to my next woman, Betsy Ross. So you might know Betsy Ross as a woman who sewed the first American flag. And while we believe that story to be true, it is hard to say with 100% certainty that that is the case, because there are no surviving documents from her time period that said she did. But we have the sworn affidavits of her children and grandchildren in the 1870s, almost 100 years after the first American flag was to have been created. So to show you, you can see there is the flag behind me, but then I also have the fabric flag here that I will show you. So Betsy Ross's, there we go. So Betsy Ross's children and grandchildren swore that she had created the first American flag. And they recount the story that George Washington, Robert Morris, and George Ross came to her house with this design because they were on the flag committee and asked her if she could make it. Now, things we do know about Betsy Ross. One is that, well, her last name was Ross. She was married to a man named Ross, and George Ross, who was on the flag committee, was her husband's uncle. At the time, it was her late husband, because he had died during the American Revolution, during the early part of the American Revolution. So that's one thing that makes it seem very plausible. She had a connection to someone on the flag committee. We also know for certain that she had done some sewing for General Washington. She had made his bed hangings that go on his bed, and also that she had sewn some buttons on for him. She also went to the same church as him, and we know her pew was right next to his. So all things seem plausible that Betsy Ross did sew the first American flag up to this point. It was said that she was the one who suggested that the flag, that these stars be sewn into a circle and that they be 5-point instead of 6-point, because it was easier to create and to sew. It would later become said that the stars on the flag were put in a circle to represent that each colony, which they represent, was equal, and that none was above the other. We aren't exactly sure there, because there are not that many documents survive from the flag committee to say why they chose red, white, and blue, but we do have the documents from the seal, when they created the Great Seal of America, that say they chose the red for courage, the white for innocence, and then the blue for vigilance. Or as some people attribute George Washington to saying, we stole the stars from the sky, we stole the red from the British, and we have the white because that represented them seceding from the mother country. So a lot of the American Revolution ideas and sayings and things like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree are a little bit more well, legendary than historical fact. So we have kind of the American myth of these things. But there are, again, not necessarily for George Washington chopping down the turkey, that's just completely a legend. But for Betsy Ross, there is some historical fact that back up her making the flag. We know she made American flags. We aren't sure she made the first American flag. That's really hard to say because there is payment for her making flags for the Continental Army, for the Navy, but we aren't just, it's really hard to say, and we can't say for certain if it was indeed the first. But it does seem plausible. I would also, I'm just going to say, sometimes we get confused with the Betsy Ross flag and then the Star-Spangled Banner. So to clear that up very quickly, this behind me is the Betsy Ross flag, this that I have folded over my arm. That's the Betsy Ross flag, the continental one that we have for the American Revolution. And then some people like to say that Mary's Pickers Guild made this flag, and that is not. She did not make, Mary Pickers Guild did not make this a flag that necessarily looked like this. She made the flag that is the Star-Spangled Banner, which inspired the national anthem, but that was not until the War of 1812, and I believe she made it in 1813. So, just so that, we'll set the record straight for that one. Mary's Pickers Guild and Betsy Ross were not in a battle over who made the first American flag, because they are in different wars and different time periods. So I believe that brings me to the end of my presentation on the ladies of the American Revolution, and now we are going to come back and answer some of your questions.
All right, let's first make sure that Glen's mic is
Yes,
back.
is my microphone working?
All right, so let's do a quick sound check for Glen. Okay, so Glen, give us a test, 1, 2, 3.
Hooray for George Washington and all the Continental Army. 1, 2, 3.
And let's see, in the meantime, until the delay catches up, our first questions is about the gun. So can you talk about how did they shoot the gun? Was there a strategy?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the way the firearm was used, you have to remember this. This is a musket. It is a smooth bore. It is not rifle. It's accurate and effective to between 50 and 100 yards. And the way you make this work is that all the men working with the musket and in the regiment or the battalion have to work together. So the motion I showed you, how I was going to load and fire it, all these men are doing that at the exact same time, just in a line. That's actually why my hat looks like it's crooked, but they wear it this way so that when I'm holding the musket up, the hat doesn't get in the way of it. So all these men, imagine, 100, 200, 300 men all lined up, and then we're going to march to where we need to go, and the officer will say, make ready, take aim, fire, and I will fire my musket. Now, and then I will come back and I will immediately begin to reload. What happens is that I'm not really probably aiming at a person. The entire battalion is aiming at another battalion. So it's very, very rare when you're in the line battalions to actually aim at an individual person. You're aiming at the mass of men, and you hope that as much of your lead can go down range as possible and hit those folks. And when you do this, I don't have my bayonet on the musket right now, but when they are in combat, that bayonet is going to remain fixed on the musket at all times in case it comes to the point where they need to charge or defend themselves from a charge.
All right, and can you talk about, maybe you mentioned this, how long it takes to fire the musket, and are there any shortcuts to make it faster?
So the question is how many shots a minute can I get out of the musket, and are there shortcuts? They're going to train, a good soldier is going to be able, a really good soldier under duress might be able to get 3 to 4 rounds a minute, but that is going really fast. You're probably going to be lucky to get 2 rounds a minute. There are some shortcuts that have been stated. This is mostly from the Napoleonic Wars later on, that when they tore off the paper cartridge, instead of just tearing the cartridge, they would actually take the ball and bite it and keep it in their mouth, pour the powder, spit the ball, and then just tap the butt of the gun twice. That may work for a couple of rounds, but with the fouling in the barrel, if that ball comes and gets stuck right here, you're going to blow the barrel of your musket up. So you're going to continue using the ramrod. The way that I showed you before, using the ramrod and going through the proper motions of the drill is by far going to be the most common way that the musket is used.
All right, Marie, do we know if Betsy Ross had children?
So the question was, do we know if Betsy Ross had children? And yes, she did, but not necessarily with her first husband, who also had the last name of Ross. She also had 2 other husbands after he passed away, and she did have, I believe, to be 7 or 8 children.
Okay. And how long do you think it would take her to make one flag?
That's a good question. I don't know how. I assume she was a good seamstress, Betsy Ross, and therefore it wouldn't take her too incredibly long to make a flag. But this is, as you can see there, here we have some stitching on it. There is some detail that you would go on to. She would have to cut and sew all of the stars as well as all of the stripes together. She was an upholsterer by trade. That's what she was apprenticed to do. Here we go. I keep holding this backwards. So I'm honestly, I've never made a flag before, and therefore I am unsure. She would have been hand sewing all of it. The sewing machine was not invented yet. So therefore I could, especially depending on how large it was, I assume it would take her several days to give a general estimate.
Excellent, excellent. Glenn, I think we're having a little bit of mic trouble again. What we can do is, if you can speak very loudly,
Yes.
you'll be picked
I'll
up
just
by
stand
Marie's
slightly
I will
closer.
speak very loudly.
Okay, so I'm going to turn your mic off. Let's just do a quick test with our audience.
Okay.
At your loudest, you might want to turn your mic off as well, just in case that's causing the static. Okay.
All right, yes, so hopefully everyone will be able to hear me.
Okay. All right, so I think that's going to be fine. So our next question is it true that mosquitoes played a significant role in affecting Cornwallis's troops?
So the question is, did mosquitoes play a role in affecting Cornwallis's troops? I think what you're getting at is malaria, and to a certain extent, yes. Anytime an army goes into camp, a good general is going to look at the ground in which the army is going to be encamped. You want it to be away from water, stagnant water. You want it to be in a place that's not stifling with air. You want it to be in plenty of sunshine. And at Yorktown, they were right next to the river. They didn't really have a choice to have a camp away from the river because they're being pressed in by the Continental Army. And so the reasons they wanted to avoid that sort of thing is they didn't quite understand how mosquitoes and germs could make malaria happen, but they did understand that certain types of topography and environmental conditions could cause infections and sickness and disease. So yes, part of Cornwallis's troops are going to be affected if they're in that area for an extended length of time, but it's not that that's what made Cornwallis lose. Basically, Cornwallis was forced to surrender because he could not be resupplied from sea, and because the French Navy had run the British Navy off. And with the British Navy not there, Cornwallis could not get fresh supplies. It doesn't matter how healthy his men were.
All right. Our next question is, what did children do at this time? What were they doing? What was family life at home? If you want to...
So what were children doing during this time, and what was family life at home like was the question. So family life was going to change a little bit because depending on where you were, your family members, like your older brothers, your father, they might go off to war, and therefore more responsibility and more chores are going to fall to the children because they're going to have to keep their farm, their estate going during this time. If you are in some of the areas that are heavily affected with fighting, that's going to also affect your life because you're going to have troops that are in your area. Sometimes British soldiers were said they lived with families. That was one of the things that they stated out, I believe, in the Constitution is the foreign army or an army is not allowed to live with you. I believe that's the third thing they decided that they definitely didn't want. Right. They did not want the military to be forcibly living with you. So if you were one of those families, you had a new house guest that you then had to get used to, and somehow get along with. I believe Betsy Ross, it is said, it is thought because it's confused as to where she was living at the time, but she might have had some British soldiers living with her for some part of the war. And that's especially her, who is definitely a patriot, and also another reason why she was chose to make the flag, because they definitely knew her her political ideas met with supporting the revolution. And you don't want to have, a loyalist try to make this perhaps traitorous flag. You have to then try to figure out how to go about your daily life with a person who very strongly is fighting against people that you support and love. Because, again, her husband was, off at war fighting with the Continental Army. How do you deal with that? It's a good question. That's something that's going to be a person-by-person basis as to how you figure out life with that.
All right. So we want to know about cannons. Can you talk to us about cannons?
Yes, so if someone wants to know a little bit more about cannons, I want all of you to believe me when I heartfelt say that I wish I had a cannon that I could show all of you and show you how they fire. So a cannon is loaded the same way as the musket, but it's very big. Sometimes they would they were basically categorized by how heavy of an iron ball they would fire. You would have 3-pounders, 6-pounders, 9-pounders, 12-pounders, but usually 3 and 6 were the ones the armies would take into the field with them. And of course they were on wheels, and they were rolled up to where they would be firing from. And even though one man can fire one musket, an artillery piece or a cannon is going to require an entire crew, and that crew could be anywhere from 5 to 10 to 12 people, depending on how big the cannon is. And it's a very careful process, but because of course you're using much larger quantities of gunpowder than you're using with a musket, and you don't want it to explode when it's not propelling a projectile out of the end of the cannon. So the crew has to work very closely together. They even swab out the cannon after each shot with a wet sponge to make sure there are no sparks inside when they put the gunpowder down. So they're going to swab the barrel with a wet sponge, and then they're going to have someone bring one round at a time from a supply wagon, from an ammunition wagon, from a caisson, or from a chest sitting beside of it. Bring that round up. They're going to put that round into the barrel. One person is, another person is going to ram it home. They have one person watching that touch hole up there where the gunpowder goes all the time. And when they ram that home, they're going to put a little spike at the end of the gun through the touch hole to open up that powder, pour a little bit of powder in there, and then they're all going to stand to the side while they take what's usually called a port fire, sort of a long stick with a piece of fuse on the end, or slow match, and they'll reach out and they'll touch the back of the cannon, and boom, the cannon will go off. And depending upon how big the cannon is, you're probably going to get maybe 2 shots a minute if you're going really fast. But the kinds of ammunition the cannons would fire, as I said, they would be solid shot, because those could just literally bounce along the ground and go through 3 or 4 men when they were fired. They could also fire grape shot, which is basically, you would imagine one big container with a lot of lead balls in it. And you would put that in the cannon, and instead of just one solid ball coming out, 50 are going to come out, and it turns that cannon into a large shotgun. So a cannon can be very, very effective on the battlefield if it's properly used and if it's in the right place at the right time.
All right. Marie, we want to know about your costume. Can you describe what it is and if you made it or not?
Yes. So I'm going for more of a frontierswoman woman that may have been like a Nancy Hart looking, would have worn, Nancy Hart kind of might have worn. So I have, first of all, my cap, which you would have your hair covered during this time period, not necessarily just for modesty's sake, but also because people didn't necessarily wash their hair all that much. And so you have that one reason why you would want it to have covered, but also if I'm, over a fire, which I do still smell like a campfire because the last time I wore this was over a campfire while I was cooking. You don't want necessarily that smell to get to you. It's much easier to just take this off and stick it in a bucket and wash my cap than it is to wash all of my hair. And it also keeps, if you have long hair, which most women did during this time period, unless you got like lice or something and you might cut it, keeping it all up is much safer and fewer, because if you're, over a fire, you don't want to catch yourself on fire. So I then have my shift on. and the shift goes under my stays. I'm doing a more frontierswoman-y thing, so I just have my my little cover over my stays, so you can actually see what those more look like. So this is very much very much like out in the fields working woman kind of outfit that I have on. And then I just have my little tucker that goes over it to prevent modesty, and also if I'm out in the fields, I don't want to get sunburned, because sunscreen has not been invented yet. I then have my petticoat on. There we are, yes. So I have my petticoat, I have my apron, I have some clocked stockings, and I have my fancy red shoes on because they're more fun. That then tie with some leather straps. And I made parts of it, but not all of it.
All right. And speaking of attire, can you talk about would the soldiers have been issued a uniform, or did they? We've heard stories of soldiers being in rags. Is that true?
Yes. So the question is, were soldiers issued their uniforms? Generally, yes. Again, if you're coming from the militia, that just means every able-bodied male of a certain age is going to be called up for military service, and when they do that, they're going to wear whatever clothes they have at home, just civilian, regular, everyday clothes. When you join a provincial unit or a continental unit, you are going to get issued a suit of clothes. That consists of the breeches, the waistcoat, this like a vest that I have on under the coat, and of course the coat. Now, it all has to do with supply. The Continental soldiers, especially in the Continental Army, are not able to have as much reliable supply and the numbers that they need to equip all of their men. So as a campaign goes along, they may not have enough new clothing or new shoes to reissue, and that's sort of where you get that idea of a Continental in rags. And during some of the winter months, like at Valley Forge and at Morristown, these coats, these clothings are going to be literally ragged. The elbows will be out, the knees will be out, their hat will be worn out, the sleeves will be just rags at the end, because that's why they have this cuff. This is always the part that wears out first. So it's not a constant thing with the Continental Army. They are going to try to keep their men as well clothed as possible, because that means they're going to be warm, they're going to be better fighters. But sometimes, if the supply slows down, they're not going to be able to continue reissuing those. And a soldier was supposed to get at least one coat, one vest, and 2 pairs of breeches per year, and that didn't always happen.
Can you talk to us about Georgia Tories? What was the revolution like in Georgia? And they want to specifically know about Georgia Tories.
You want me to take this one?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll jump in if I think of anything.
So Tories in Georgia. Tories is a word for someone who believes in their allegiance to the King of England and to the British cause. So these are people who are not patriots, who do not want independence. They want to stay within the British Empire and stay loyal to the crown. And so Georgia was the most southern colony. It was the youngest colony, and it actually had some of the lowest population of all the colonies in the New World at the time. You have to remember, we think of Georgia today as the biggest state, east of the Mississippi, but that's not the case. It's really just Savannah and Augusta and a little bit of a sliver along the coast and up the Savannah River. So it has a low population, and that makes it closer economically and politically to Great Britain. And most Georgians at the beginning in 1775 and 6 were not too keen on leaving the British crown. A lot of things start to happen. A lot of it has to do with settlement to the west. A lot of it has to do with the British deciding to use Indians, Native Americans, to fight against the Patriots. And this causes a lot of Georgians to sort of start to ease in to being in favor of the Patriot cause. Now, lots of people remained loyalists. Savannah remained, it was taken over initially in the war by the Patriots, but then the British capture it in 1778, and it stays, Savannah, the state capital, stays British for the rest of the war until they leave after peace is declared. And a lot of those Georgia Tories lose their property, they lose their land, they have to go out of the country. So a lot of them go to the West Indies, to the Bahamas, some of them go back to England. But there are some really interesting perspectives of not just Georgia Tories, but Tories up and down the eastern seacoast. And I think it's important, if you want to go read some of their accounts, you can't consider them traitors. They're faced with a very, very difficult position and a very, very difficult decision to make. And some of them choose to be patriots, some of them choose to remain loyal to the crown, even after the war. So a lot of, and so Georgia Tories are some of the most notorious Tories during the entire American Revolution.
Cam, who is 9, wants to know, what was the most important battle and why?
You go and then I'll go. What do you think the most important battle was?
So I would say the most important battle would be the Battle of Yorktown, because that's when everything kind of, we won the war basically then, I would say.
Right, fair enough, fair enough. I will choose the Battle of Saratoga because that's what convinced the French to come in on the American cause. That's the battle that said, oh, maybe the Americans will win, let's give them ships and men and money. But this is the sort of thing that historians love to argue about, Cam. So there's no right or wrong answer. There's only opinions. So would love to, maybe hear the next time what you think the most important battle was.
So how much was a soldier paid?
That is a fantastic question, and I'm so glad that you asked. The question is, how much was a soldier paid? A continental soldier was supposed to be paid 8 Spanish milled dollars a month, and this is a Spanish milled dollar, right? This is where we get dollars from, is from the Spanish types of money. You can see that there. It's a silver coin. It has value. But even before the war, it was very hard to get actual silver or gold money in the colonies, and so they began to issue paper. And that means that they were just giving paper back and forth for money, and you can start to see how some of these denominations, we have some bills here, and so to give you an idea of how much inflation is when money is not worth as much as it used to be. So we have a Georgia paper money here from 1776 for $1, right? So by the time of 1779, that's 3 years later, things had gotten bad, that almost the same buying power would be used for this $40 bill, right? And the same thing with the continental money. We have here $1. As I said, a continental soldier is supposed to be paid $8 a month. We have one here. Notice how this is paper. This doesn't have any real value like silver or gold. So this is $1. This is 1776. Again, by the time we get to 1779, see if you can see how much that is. $80. $80. In other words, this one piece of paper is supposed to represent how much a continental soldier gets for 10 months of service. So can you imagine supposed to get 8 of those silver dollars a month, and then they say, oh, we're 10 months behind on your pay. Here. What does this even do? How much can this buy? It can pretty much buy nothing. And a lot of continental soldiers, therefore, are never really paid in money. Some of them are promised land in the West after the war is won. So a continental soldier, what he was supposed to get paid and what he actually got paid are two very different things.
Right. How did the role of militias differ from the Continental Army?
So the question is, what is the difference between a militia and the Continental Army? So a militia, as I said, is really about defense and not attack. It was in a specific area, either in a colony or even in a county. They would call up the militia, and that meant every able-bodied male between the ages of usually about 18 to 45 would have to come with their own weapons and defend that area. And as soon as the danger was over, they would go back home. Whether that was 2 days, whether that was 3 days, whether it was 2 weeks. But that's all the militia could do. A continental soldier signed up to be in the army for at least 1 year, sometimes for 2 years, and later on in the war, a continental soldier signed up for the duration of the war. In other words, he was signing up to continue serving until the war was over. So it really meant that you were much more dedicated, and that also meant that you were going to get better equipment and better training. So the militia just comes together, fights a little bit, and then goes home. You don't have time to train them on that proper way to use muskets and lines and things like that. Whereas the Continentals are going to be the real soldiers. They're going to be the ones who have the equipment and the training to win.
Okay. Marie, were there other contenders for the design that we know of?
So the question was, were there other contenders for the design of the first continental flag? And from what we don't necessarily have any like paper designs that are necessarily left. We have some people recounting things. One of Betsy Ross's children or grandchildren said that they originally came to her and said that the stars were not in this circle in this field. They were just kind of all spread out along the flag, like they were just stars. And so she recommended that they all get pushed to the circle. And they originally had also said that they had 6-point stars instead of 5-point stars. And then she suggested the 5-point as legend goes. So slight variations, but we aren't sure if there's any just incredibly different looking flags.
Okay. Glenn, can you talk to us about spies and conveying intelligence?
So the question is, did the armies use spies? Did they use conveying intelligence? Did they use secret messages? Yes, they certainly did. Both sides wanted to know what the other's plans were. Both sides wanted to know how many men the other side had or things like that. And so both sides used spies. They would use women sometimes. They would use men. And they had to get these messages and get this information. This could be very, very dangerous for the spies, because if I'm fighting a battle and I'm captured in this uniform, I'm considered a prisoner of war. They're not going to kill me. They're not supposed to mistreat me because I've fought honorably and I've made it obvious which side I'm on. If you're a spy, you're hiding who you are. You're dishonorable. And if they catch you, you could immediately be hanged. And this is something that happened during the Revolution, probably the most... there are a couple of famous cases. There is the British spy, Major Andre, who was captured, was involved in Benedict Arnold turning traitor. And early on in the war, there was someone who was spying for the Patriot side, Nathan Hale. And he was also captured. And they found out he was a spy. They found a secret message on him, and they hanged him from a tree almost immediately. And when asked what if he had any last words, he supposedly said, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." Now, there were some other spy things that happened during the war and sort of sneaky tricks. For example, I was telling you about those continental paper dollars. Well, one of the reasons that they weren't worth very much is because the British had an idea that if they printed a lot of fake continental dollars, by thousands and thousands of them, they would make all the continental dollars worth a lot less. So they had printers printing up all kinds of fake continental dollars and just paying for everything and putting them out into the economy, and that totally crushed the continental currency system. So there's a lot of spy and intelligence and economic war that goes on with that.
It was also said that Mary Hart was a spy, that she would dress up, because remember, she's like this 6-foot burly woman, so it doesn't take much for her to dress up like a man, and perhaps she pretended to be a feeble-minded man and would stumble into the camps of the British, as the story goes, and then try to get intelligence and then pass it on to the Continental Army.
All right. Last question is a good one to conclude on. Is there a particular misinformation or myth that you want to rectify about the American Revolution right now?
I think I rectified my Mary Pickers Guild flag versus Betsy Ross flag earlier on in this program, but sometimes people get confused as to Mary Pickers Guild's flag, which she made during the War of 1812, which is like the Star-Spangled Banner. Betsy Ross did not make the Star-Spangled Banner. She was alive during that time. She didn't die until the 1830s, but she did not make that flag. That was Mary Pickers Guild. She made a flag that looked like this, which may or may not have been the first one.
I think the one I would like to dispel the most is a very common one that has to do with how the war was fought. People have this idea that the British were stupid because they all marched in big straight lines and wore big red coats, and marched around on the battlefield while the Americans hid behind trees and rocks and fired their muskets all sneaky like that, and that's why Americans won the war and the British didn't. It's so much more complicated than that. General Washington himself did not like the militia. He did not like the ones who did go fight behind trees and rocks and fences. He knew the only way to win was to have those soldiers who could stand in lines and who could use their muskets and fight just as hard as those redcoats. They had to be able to match them man for man on the battlefield if America had even a hope of maintaining its independence. And so the Americans did eventually begin to develop fighting styles like that, and even in the North and in the South, one of the reasons America was able to win the war and win battles is because they had soldiers who could fight just as well as the British. So that's the great thing about the American Revolution. There are so many great narratives. There are so many complexities about it. There's so many individual stories like Nathan Hale and Nancy Hart and Betsy Ross. We hope you go out and do a lot more research on this. Thanks for tuning in today. I wish we had more time. Thanks, Marie, for joining us again.
Absolutely.
We love doing these. Be sure and tune in tomorrow. We're going to be looking at the American frontier. We're going to look a little bit specifically at like the early American frontier here in the Southeast, but we'll look at the entire thing. And we hope that you've enjoyed these. We hope you tell all your friends and all your family. Please continue to watch. If you can give us any financial support during this time, we appreciate it. Just go to our website at www.negahc.org and click that donate button. But if you can't, that's okay. We're just glad to have you. So until we see you next time, stay safe and take care.